Welcome to the College Connection podcast, a podcast presented by the College of Registered Nurses of Newfoundland and Labrador. This is the College Connection podcast.
Welcome to the College Connection podcast. My name is Kelly Kane, and I'm a registered nurse and a nursing consultant with policy and practice at the College of Registered Nurses of Newfoundland and Labrador.
Hi, I'm Michelle Carpenter. I'm an RN and a nursing consultant for policy and practice at the college as well.
Today's episode is Duty to Report, your obligation as a registered nurse. And we are pleased to welcome our guest, Brenda Carroll, Director of Professional Conduct Review here at the college. Hi, Brenda. How are you today?
Really good, thanks. Happy to be here.
Thanks so much for being here. Brenda, we know the college's mandate is public protection, and therefore, the college must intervene when practice is unacceptable. A registered nurse who has directly observed or has objective evidence of conduct deserving of sanction of another RN has a duty to report. We know that there is confusion or misconceptions among RNs about their duty to report. Can you help clarify what duty to report means?
This is a really good question and very timely because I think historically Section 20 of the Registered Nurses Act has been interpreted in different ways. Letter of the law, the section says the duty to report if you have direct observable objective evidence is the RN has to call the Director of Professional Conduct Review, which is me at the college, and report that conduct. Historically, I think, particularly in Newfoundland, I do know for certain that the message has usually been that if you report it to your manager in the workplace and they are managing that situation, that is sufficient to, fulfill your duty to report. There's been some changes in the recent history, particularly coming out of the Wettlaufer inquiry in Ontario. And what happened in that particular situation was the registrant had practiced in a number of different locations. And many of those locations where she had practiced had dealt with practice issues. And issues had been reported within the workplace, dealt with within the workplace. The registrant had been terminated at times from workplaces. But not every one of those situations was reported to the college. And so that overarching umbrella view of what was going on with this particular individual was slower for everybody to pick up on. So that's where the duty to report directly to the college stems from. And that's a shift here. So we're telling our registrants here in Newfoundland, absolutely do your due diligence within the workplace, but you do have an obligation, that duty to report directly to the college.
So, Brenda, Kelly and I get calls within the practice department from RNs and NPs wondering about their duty to report. Obviously, the duty to report is incumbent upon RNs and NPs. However, sometimes RNs and NPs are unsure of the process or even what they witnessed meets the threshold for duty to report. Can you walk us through how you would assist an RN when they call you to fulfill their duty to report?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously the first thing is someone calls, the first thing I'm going to make sure is obviously that the patient is safe, right? So before anybody picks up the phone and reports a duty to report situation, they should be making sure the patient is safe. They should be following their employer policy within the workplace, letting a manager know. Once those things are taken care of, so that means documenting, putting in CRS, whatever your employer policy says how you would manage it. Once all of those things are taken care of, they can pick up the phone and they can call either yourselves in practice or they can call me directly in the PCR department, the Professional Conduct Review department. And my first question would be, tell me what you saw, tell me what happened. And essentially the thought process or the navigation is, what did you see, what do you know, and how does that correlate to the standards of practice for a registered nurse or nurse practitioner and the code of ethics? And if you believe that what you witnessed, what you saw, did not meet the standards of practice or contravene the code of ethics, then that's in all likelihood going to give rise to at least an apprehension that there's some questionable conduct happening, and that should be reported.
So you did mention registrants can call Michelle Roy, if they have questions. When would be like a situation where they would reach out to Michelle Roy to discuss, as opposed to yourself?
If they're not sure, if they're really, they can always call me, but quite frankly, the practice consultants are probably the best resource if they're not sure.
Yes.
If they're really not sure what they saw is reportable, if it's conduct deserving of sanction within the definition of the Act and those things, then having a call with practice to talk that through and navigate that is always a good first step. I know that if you have those calls and you believe that, this is clearly falls into the concerning conduct that might give rise to conduct deserving of sanction, you will often loop to me, or you'll point the caller in my direction. If the caller is very certain, if you're a registered nurse on the floor and you see something that is obviously unacceptable conduct, i.e., let's say a nurse hit a patient, was abusive to a patient, that's obvious going to fall into a bucket of conduct deserving of sanction. Then they can just call me directly. Make sure the patient is safe, follow your employer policy, report it within your organization, and then pick up the phone and give me a call. But when they call me, that doesn't necessarily mean they're launching a formal complaint. There's two aspects to these situations. One is fulfilling the duty to report for the person who witnessed it, and the other one is dealing with the registrant who actioned it. And what we want to make sure is, because there's that duty to report in the legislation, that we have a placeholder for people to say, I know that I have a duty to report. I know that the legislation says that duty to report is directly to the college, and I want to make sure I fulfill that obligation. Because maybe this situation, when you report it, the manager is going to be addressed perfectly appropriately, and it's going to be, managed, and no further harm will come, and the individual who was involved, the registrant that is guilty of the conduct, is going to, never have another problem again in their entire career. But if not, or if it's tip of the iceberg, or there's other things going on, or there are future episodes, and there's ever some kind of inquiry or look back, you as a registered nurse can say, I did my due diligence. I brought that concern forward. And so we have a process whereby if they know that it's conduct deserving a sanction, the registrant can call me, and we will, on their profile, make a note to say they called on this date to report this type of situation. We're not going to identify the nurse that was involved, the other nurse involved, but we'll just make a note that you called with a concern. If it's egregious enough that we believe, like let's say it was, for instance, a registrant being abusive to a client, it may very well be that as the director, I might go ahead and file the complaint for myself. There is latitude in the legislation for me to do that. And the reason I bring that up is because I think for a lot of people, the stumbling block they have on the duty to report is they don't want to be the snitch, right? You work with your colleagues, you work as part of a team, it's collaborative care. It's hard to be that person who picks up the phone sometimes and puts someone else's livelihood at risk, right? And so we appreciate that scenario. So giving the placeholder to call and report something doesn't necessarily mean you're the person that has to file the official complaint.
Absolutely. So for the audience, we're going to do a future episode on what is conduct deserving a sanction. But we often hear the terms, and you've referred to them today, like allegation, complaint form, complaint. So could you explain to the audience how a concern, you get a call from a registered nurse with a concern, how that moves from a concern to a complaint, then onto an allegation, and then possibly onto a complaint?
For sure. So when someone calls with a question or an observation, that is just a concern, and we will document those. If there's enough information or it's serious enough, Or sometimes we don't get a call ahead of time, I just get a complaint form. That's kind of the second step.
Yes.
So we get the concern, we ask some questions, we dig around a bit, we find out some information. If there's enough there that we think, ooh, this is something that we really need to put through the conduct review process, some way, either from a person from the public, professional practice within the health authority, sometimes from colleagues, sometimes from other healthcare professionals, we'll get a complaint form in. And that complaint form triggers the actual review process. So once we have an actual complaint form, and sometimes I get those complaint forms in and they are all kinds of strange things that we just get randomly. Sometimes they're things that aren't really within our mandate. Sometimes they're very concerning things.
Yes.
So the complaint form comes in, we have no control over it once that complaint form comes in the door. Every complaint form that comes into the department goes through the process.
Right.
So in comes the complaint form, we receive it, we review it, we make sure we have enough information that we can give the registrant involved a clear picture of what the complaint is. And then we send that complaint form out to the registrant and say, we've received this. You please take a look, please read it. We advise all our registrants to get legal counsel and get assistance with these things, no matter how frivolous you think the complaint form contents are. Get legal counsel and give us your story. You have about 3 weeks once you get that letter to give us a reply.
Brenda, I'm sorry to
That's
interrupt
okay.
your training. I was just thinking when you mentioned legal counsel, I know we use the CNPS as our professional liability protection. Is that what you mean when you say legal counsel? Like reach out to CNPS?
I would say always reach out to CNPS. If you have just the basic coverage through CNPS, they will at least give you some advice and direction about what to do now that you've got this form in your hand that came to you in the mail. If you have the advanced coverage or the supplemental coverage, they will actually provide you with legal assistance through the whole process. So yes, if you ever receive a complaint form, I would say your first call should be to CNPS.
Okay. All right. Sorry, yes, and you were working through the process.
So yeah,
of when
so
you get
then
the
the complaint form comes in, we send it out, we get your response.
Yes.
And it will go to what's called our Complaints Authorization Committee for review. And if the Complaints Authorization Committee feels like there's reasonable grounds to believe that there might be conduct deserving of sanction within the documents, within the situation, they may then lodge a formal complaint and forward that complaint to the disciplinary panel.
Okay.
And who picks up the Complaints Authorization Committee?
It's actually a mix of all from our CRNNL College Council board, and it's a mix of registered nurses and nurse practitioners that sit on the board as well as public representatives. So it's a minimum of 3, 1 public rep, 2 registrants, but we often have like around 5 we usually have, so we get a good cross section of opinions and experience at the table.
Thank you.
And Brenda, when you're walking through the process there about complaint and then going through the CAC, so will the registrant have anything under file as soon as that complaint form comes in? Because I know you mentioned we can't control what's on that complaint form. Is that something then that shows up on their file with the college that they have received a complaint?
Internally, yes.
Okay.
So there wouldn't be anything if you did a public search, like on the
Yes.
nursing search engine on our website,
Right.
and you looked for Brenda Carroll.
Yes.
You wouldn't necessarily see anything public facing in that
Okay.
regard.
Mhm.
But internally, we would put a flag on the file to say that there is a discipline complaint in the process.
Mhm.
And then it would stay there until resolution. And then it depends on what happens with resolution. If there is finding of conduct deserving of sanction, that will actually stay. And in some instances, we published all outcomes of disciplinary complaints on the website. And some of them are anonymous, others are not. Just depends on which process they've gone through. So dismissals, for instance, we would publish anonymously.
Right.
And some of the other agreed upon resolutions, like if we resolve something by an agreement, we publish those anonymously. But if a matter goes to a full hearing, those hearing decisions are published with the name of the registrant on the public-facing webpage.
Okay. So I think from your key message from that question that Michelle asked, when in doubt, registrants should reach out to the college, right? If they're not clear about something, reach out and get guidance. Calling to fulfill their duty of report doesn't necessarily mean that they're the one making the complaint either, right? So I think that's a key message. It's just, if you're unsure about something, reach out to the college.
Yeah, and I think in that regard, the other thing that I've often will say, particularly, this is always a hot topic of discussion when I talk to the graduating classes of the faculties across the province, is, this sort of frightened sort of piece of, I'm going to be the new person on the unit, and what if I see somebody do something wrong and then I have to report them? I guess the other thing to keep in mind is, yes, you report it, because that's about you. That's about your duty to report. It's not about what happens to the other person. It's not about snitching on someone. You're raising something to the attention of the college, but at the end of the day, it's your responsibility for a duty to report. And, if you fail in that duty, then you put yourself at risk to be subject to an allegation. And so, you have to think about, are you willing to sacrifice your own license and your own ability to practice as a registered nurse and your own values and ethics, to save somebody else or to avoid an uncomfortable situation? And so that's a lot to ask. So we've worked, and I always tell the fourth year students, you've worked very hard to get where you are, and you've achieved a lot, and you're just embarking upon a practice. And that goes for someone who's got 5 years experience or 25 years experience. You've got a lot invested into your profession, and turning a blind eye to conduct that's concerning and not reporting it puts you at risk. And I don't think, anybody would want to make that trade. Not to mention, at the end of the day, we're all here for the safety and well-being of the patients. So particularly if the conduct you witness did or could put a patient at risk, that's another element to consider, right? Like if you saw something, you turned a blind eye, it happens again, patient is harmed, that's a lot to live with, for in perpetuity, really, to think that maybe if you had raised a hand, that situation might have been avoided for someone else.
Absolutely. And it's really important as a self-regulated healthcare professional or registered nurse that we know what our legal and regulatory obligations are as a registered nurse. So thank you.
So unfortunately, the college do receive complaints regarding practice of registered nurses and nurse practitioners. How would an RN navigate the professional conduct review process if they are subject of an allegation?
Yeah, and I would say my first word of advice is please don't ignore communication from the college, because, and it happens now and again, and you know what, I can honestly say, I know with the college, we've made a really conscious effort not to be spamming our registrants with emails day after day after day after day, to the point where when something comes in that says College of Registered Nurses, Newfoundland and Labrador, people are like, oh, not again. I think it's all junk mail. So we've made a conscious effort in that regard as an organization. So my word of wisdom to people is keep your information in the database updated, first of all. So if you move or you change your email address, don't put an email address in your database for Alinity that you don't check. We have a lot of people who put a work email address in there and they maybe check it like once a month. So make sure we can get a hold of you, because you do have an obligation under the Act and the regulations to keep that information updated if it changes within 30 days. So keep that information updated, which means we can get a hold of you.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Brenda, because is it email? Would someone expect correspondence via email?
That's our first.
Okay.
We'll send it through the Alinity system as of April 1st.
Right.
It'll all go through the Alinity system.
Yeah.
And so it will go directly to registrants. We get read receipts, those kind of things we can track. If we don't get a response from our registrant through an email, we will send registered mail or even potentially try personal service if we have to actually go find someone.
Yes.
But like I said, if you put your email address in the Linity, you're saying this is how the college can get a hold of me. And that's what our first go-to.
Mhm.
If you do receive a letter of complaint, don't panic, first of all. Would be my first word of advice. Second of all, don't ignore it. Call CNPS, see what coverage you may or may not have through them and what kind of assistance they can lend you. And then the other thing I always assure registrants is our process is based on fairness, transparency, and procedural fairness and natural justice rules. So as much as we have to take things very seriously, particularly, I mean, sometimes we get frivolous things that come to us that aren't founded or outside the mandate, and other times we have very serious things coming across my desk, and we have to treat them all the same in the process. And so we will put everything through the process, we will be transparent, we will be fair, but our goal is always to help the registrant remediate and get back to a place where they're practicing safely, competently, and ethically. And so, again, work with us, we'll work with you. So we've had some pretty significant situations. We've had people who have been, ill with things that have impacted their ability to practice, whether they be temporary illnesses, or we've had registrants with substance misuse disorders who have been in really difficult places. And that hasn't necessarily meant your career is over, right? Just because someone has sort of blown the whistle, so to say, or brought the issue forward, or you've, sort of maybe even been caught diverting narcotics. I mean, it's not a great place to be, and we take these very seriously. But we will work with registrants to craft a resolution that helps them get back and puts in some very strict constraints and monitoring and observation and some hoops and hurdles, so to speak, that will ensure that we help them get back to a safe, competent, ethical practice and monitor that for a period of time going forward so that we know we've seen sustained change and we're not putting any of the public or patients at risk. So don't panic, respond, get the legal advice, and like I said, stay in communication with us and work with us. And if, being honest and transparent is sometimes very difficult in very challenging situations, but that integrity and accountability is a really critical piece to how we can support registrants to sort of find their way back to practicing if they've been in a difficult situation.
Excellent. Yeah. And so, keeping your profile information in Linity up to date, within, if you do move or if there's a name change or anything like that, within 30 days, to update the college, so that they can be contacted if needed, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much, Brenda. That concludes our episode with the Director of Professional Conduct Review, Brenda Carroll. So thanks again, Brenda. And we look forward to having you back soon in our studio so that we can discuss conduct deserving of sanction. And thanks to our audience for tuning in to today's episode, Duty to Report, Your Obligation as a Registered Nurse.
Thanks, Brenda.
This has been a presentation of the College of Registered Nurses of Newfoundland and Labrador.